The first time people noticed what was happening on the Mercer property, most of them figured the family had finally fallen apart. For 3 weeks that April, the south end of Garner County shook with the grinding roar of a rented excavator. Neighbors driving past on County Road 7 slowed their trucks and squinted. A few pulled over entirely. A 15-year-old boy was operating the machine. His name was Caleb Mercer. Skinny, sun-darkened, quiet in the way that made adults uncomfortable because they couldn't decide if he was shy or if he simply had nothing to say to people who hadn't earned the conversation. And he was tearing up 60 acres of the finest soybean ground in the county like a man possessed. He was digging a hole. Massive, deliberate, carefully graded, right in the heart of land his grandfather had spent 43 years keeping alive. By the end of the 3rd week, it was the size of a football field and deep enough to swallow a grown man. Word reached the Garner County Feed and Supply before sunrise on a Monday. Bud Eckerman shook his head. That excavator rental alone is $6,000-7,000. Who lets a 15-year-old sign for that? Dale Pruitt, who ran 300 head of Black Angus next door, crossed his arms. The boy's building himself a fishing pond. His granddaddy dies. His daddy's been gone for years, and now the kid wants a place to sit with a rod. Can't blame him. But that's good loam he's pulling out of rotation. The room laughed. Knowing nods. Pitying looks over styrofoam cups. Only 2 people didn't laugh. Maxine Trotter, who had managed the feed store for 30 years, said one thing before walking away. His grandfather did things that didn't make sense before. And then they did. Gerald Fitch, a retired conservation officer by the window, said something even fewer heard. That's not shaped like a fishing pond. He's sizing it like a reservoir. Nobody paid attention to either of them. They should have. Because before that summer was over, before the wells dropped and the fields turned brittle and grown men stood in cracked mud, staring at empty ponds, every person in that room would stand at the edge of Caleb Mercer's property and see something none of them had been wise enough to build. Water, 12 feet of it, still as glass, sitting in the middle of a dead county like a miracle planned all along. And more than a few would think the same quiet thought. I wish I had listened to a 15-year-old boy. To understand what Caleb was building, you have to understand who taught him to listen. He didn't play football, didn't talk much in class, sat in the back row with his grandfather's dirt under his fingernails. But put him on that land, and he became someone else entirely. He could stand at the edge of a field reading the sky the way other boys scrolled their phones. He got that from his grandfather. Harlan Mercer farmed that property for 43 years. He planted cover crops before anyone knew what they were. Rotated fields before anyone called it sustainable. He never explained a decision he'd already made. The results spoke. Caleb spent every summer following him fence line to fence line. Harlan taught him to read the color of soil to watch birds shift direction before any forecast caught up. The land talks, Caleb, his grandfather said once. Most people are just too busy to hear it. He also told Caleb something about the herons. Back when Harlan was a boy, before the county drilled deep wells and pumped the water table down, great blue herons nested everywhere. They stood in creeks, ponds, wet meadows, anywhere the water stayed long enough to hold life. When the herons leave, the water's going, Harlan said. When they come back, you did something right. Caleb hadn't seen a heron in Garner County in his entire life. Harlan died on a Tuesday in October. Quietly in his sleep on the land he never left. Caleb was 13. For 2 years, he helped his mother, Renee, keep the farm alive. Woke before dawn, fed livestock, fixed what broke, did the work of a grown man with algebra homework due on Mondays. Renee held the rest together by force of will and a second job. Night shifts at the county hospital, 3 towns over. She drove 40 minutes each way, came home at 5 a.m., slept until 7, then started the farm day like she hadn't spent the night on her feet in fluorescent light. She never complained. She never told Caleb how tired she was. She just said the same thing every morning when he walked through the kitchen. "Eat before you go." That was her way of saying, "I believe in you," without putting the weight of it on a boy who was already carrying enough. Then, one February evening, cleaning out his grandfather's desk, Caleb found the notebook. 30 years of handwriting, rainfall records, water table measurements, drainage maps, and in the back, folded carefully, a detailed drawing. An on-farm reservoir, every slope calculated, every channel mapped, designed to hold 18 million gallons. No pumps, no power lines, just gravity and patience. His grandfather had designed a water bank, spent 30 years perfecting it, and never built it. Caleb knew why. Harlan had told him about the summer of 1988, the drought that nearly ended everything. 11 weeks hauling water by hand, 20% of the crop lost, 4 years of debt. He swore he'd never be caught like that again. Studied hydrology, visited a farmer named Eugene Stahl, who'd built ponds in the 70s that kept his operation alive while his neighbors went under. He planned it all, drew it all, and then the years just went, until there were no years left. Between 2 pages of the reservoir drawing, Caleb found something else. A folded piece of paper softer than the others. Not a measurement, not a calculation. A letter. No name on it. But the handwriting was unmistakable. "You're the only one who ever stood still long enough to hear what I was trying to say. I don't know if I'll finish this pond. My back is slower than my plans now. But if you're reading this and I'm not standing beside you, I want you to know the water is already there. It's always been there. You just have to give it a place to stay." Caleb read it once. Then again, then he folded it carefully, put it in his shirt pocket, and walked outside to the fence line where his grandfather used to stand. The sky was gray. The wind smelled like frozen dirt. "I'll build it for you," he said to no one. From that day forward, the letter never left his pocket. Every morning he put on a clean shirt and moved the letter to the new one. Every day he sat in that excavator with his grandfather's words pressed against his chest. When people asked what he was building, he said the same thing every time. A pond. And that was all he said. The skepticism came fast. Dale walked over the first week, arms crossed, boots planted in the dirt, like a man who had come to deliver a verdict, not ask a question. "You're pulling productive ground out of rotation, son. Your granddaddy spent 40 years building that soil." "I know," Caleb said. Nothing more. Dale walked away and told 3 people at the feed store the boy was in over his head. By that afternoon, the whole county had an opinion. Gerald Fitch tried again at the next morning coffee. "Nobody's talking about the shape. That excavation is graded like a watershed basin. He's building something specific." Bud laughed. "He's 15, Gerald. He's building a mess." The conversation moved on. Gerald stayed by the window, quiet, watching the road that led toward the Mercer property, like a man who knew something the room wasn't ready to hear. At school it was worse. Someone taped a printed photo of a mud pit to Caleb's locker with the words "Mercer's swimming pool" written in black marker. A kid in his biology class asked if he was training to be a gravedigger. Another one drew a stick figure drowning in a hole and slid it across the desk during math. Then came the one that cut. Dale Pruitt's son, a junior named Cody, who had never worked a day on his father's ranch without being told exactly what to do, walked up to Caleb in the hallway and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "My dad says your granddad's land is wasted on a kid who thinks he's a farmer." Caleb looked at him, didn't blink, didn't answer, just peeled the photo off his locker, put it in his pocket, and walked to his next class. That night he sat on the porch longer than usual. Didn't open the notebook. Didn't eat the dinner his mother left on the counter. Just sat with his boots still on, staring at the dark line where the field met the sky. Renee watched him from the kitchen window. She dried the same plate 3 times without noticing. She wanted to walk out there and tell him he didn't have to do this, that he was 15, that nobody would blame him for stopping. But she didn't, because she knew that if she said those words, some part of him might believe them, and that part would be the part that belonged to Harlan. She left the plate on the rack, turned off the kitchen light, and let her son sit with whatever was building inside him. Photorealistic interior shot from inside a farmhouse kitchen, looking outward through a window. The next morning, Caleb was on the excavator before sunrise. Photorealistic, dramatic silhouette shot of a skinny 15-year-old boy with sun-darkened tan skin, short, messy, dark brown hair, wearing faded, worn denim jeans, dusty work boots, and a plain tan cotton button-up shirt. Caleb climbing into the cab of a yellow excavator at pre-dawn. The eastern horizon glows deep orange-pink, while the rest of the sky is still arc purple-blue. The massive excavation pit, visible below raw earth, catching the first light. Determination in his posture. Photorealistic cinematic sunrise silhouette. Epic scale 16:9 aspect ratio. The land fought back. 12 feet down, the excavator hit heavy clay. 2 extra days lost regrading. The bucket teeth wore faster than expected. Then, on a Thursday afternoon, the hydraulic line ruptured. The machine groaned, shuddered, and went still. Caleb sat in the cab for a long time, hands on the controls. Nothing moving. Just the wind and the sound of a half-finished hole holding nothing. He called the rental company. The part had to ship from out of state. 5 days minimum. 5 days, Caleb said. Best we can do. You want us to send someone out? No, I'll wait. He hung up and climbed down from the cab, stood next to the dead machine in the middle of a hole that suddenly looked like nothing more than a very expensive grave for his grandfather's dream. Dale drove past that evening, slowed down, looked at the still excavator, and shook his head slowly enough for Caleb to see it from across the field. By morning, the word at the feed store was simple. Machine's dead. Kid's done. But Caleb wasn't done. On the first day without the excavator, he picked up a shovel. He walked down into the hole at 6 a.m. and started digging by hand. Not fast, not far. The clay was thick and heavy and fought every bite of the blade. By noon, he had moved maybe a quarter of what the machine could move in 10 minutes. He kept going. Second day, same thing. Shovel, clay, sun, silence. His hands blistered on the first morning. By the second afternoon, the blisters broke. He wrapped them with tape from the barn and kept digging. Third day. Gerald Fitch drove out. Didn't say a word. Just stood at the rim and watched a 15-year-old boy dig clay out of the earth with bleeding hands and a shovel that was too big for his frame. Gerald watched for 20 minutes. Then he took off his hat, put it back on, and drove away. He didn't tell anyone at the feed store what he'd seen. Some things are too honest for rooms full of doubt. Fourth day. Renee found Caleb asleep on the porch at 4 a.m., still in his boots, shovel leaning against the rail, hands wrapped in bloody tape. She didn't wake him. She drove to the county hospital, worked her shift, drove back, and left a fresh roll of tape and a plate of eggs on the porch table before he opened his eyes. Fifth day. The part arrived. Caleb had the machine running again by noon. He climbed into the cab with his hands still taped and picked up exactly where he had left off. Nobody at the feed store knew he had spent 5 days digging by hand. Nobody except Gerald who knew, and Renee who had counted every one of those mornings from the kitchen window. That night was the worst. The hydraulic line was fixed. The machine was running. But the bank was calling about the equipment loan. The clay layer had added cost. The timeline had stretched. And every person Caleb knew except his mother and a retired conservation officer who brought maps on Tuesdays thought he was destroying his grandfather's land. Rain started falling around 9 p.m., light at first, then steady. Caleb sat on the porch with the notebook open on his knees. The pages were getting soft from handling. The ink on the reservoir drawing was starting to fade at the edges. For the first time, he thought the whole county might be right. He was 15. He was digging a hole the size of a football field on land that used to grow soybeans. His mother was working double shifts to pay for a machine that had already broken once. His hands were wrapped in tape. His grades were slipping, and the hole was still empty. He almost closed the notebook for good. His fingers tightened around the cover. One motion. Close it. Put it in the drawer. Walk away. Be a normal kid. Let the county be right. Then the rain got heavier, and Caleb watched the water run off the porch roof down the gutter into the yard, following the lowest ground, curving left where the soil dipped, pooling where the grade dropped. No pump, no pipe, no engine, just gravity. Exactly the way his grandfather had designed the reservoir. The water knew where to go. It had always known. It just needed someone to give it a place to stay. Caleb opened the notebook again, turned to the last page, the one that wasn't a measurement or a calculation, the one his grandfather had written in a different handwriting than the rest. Slower, more careful, like he knew these would be the words that mattered most. The land rewards those who prepare, not those who pray. Caleb closed the notebook, but he didn't put it away. The next morning, Gerald Fitch was waiting by the fence line when Caleb walked out. He was holding a rolled tube of paper and a thermos of coffee. "I brought you something," Gerald said. He unrolled the paper on the hood of his truck. Geological surveys, water table data, drainage flow maps for the south end of the county going back 20 years. "Your grandfather showed me this design once," Gerald said. 20 years ago, over coffee at the feed store. I told him it would work. He said he wasn't ready yet." Caleb looked at the maps, then at Gerald. Why wasn't he ready? Gerald looked out at the half-finished hole. The morning light was low and gold across the raw earth. Because he was waiting for someone who would finish it. Gerald paused. "I think he was waiting for you." From that week on, Gerald came every Tuesday. He didn't dig. He was too old for that. But he brought data advice and the quiet company of a man who had spent 30 years studying water and had never met anyone under 60 who cared enough to listen. That Saturday, Caleb's mother drove out to the site. She stood at the rim and looked down at the empty basin, the graded slopes, the half-cut channels. "The bank called," she said. Caleb looked at her. "They want to see progress, or they'll pull the loan." "What are you going to tell them?" "The truth. That Grandpa designed this 30 years ago. That it holds 18 million gallons. That when the dry times come, this is what keeps us alive." Renee looked at her son, 15 years old, standing in dirt, speaking with the certainty of a man 3 times his age. The bank approved a short extension. Reluctantly, Caleb finished alone. 16 hours a day, grading slopes, cutting channels to funnel every drop of runoff into the basin. No pumps, no power, just gravity, and a 15-year-old boy keeping a dead man's promise. The rain came in late May, not a storm, just steady, patient rain that fell for 3 days and turned every ditch in the county into a stream. Caleb stood at the edge of his reservoir in a rain jacket 2 sizes too big and watched. The channels worked. Water flowed from the upper fields exactly the way his grandfather's drawing predicted. Down the graded slopes, through the cut channels, into the basin, filling it inch by inch like a promise being kept in slow motion. By June, the pond held 6 feet. People drove past and figured the boy had his fishing pond. Something to sit beside with a rod on summer evenings. Nice enough, harmless. A kid's project that turned out okay. Nobody noticed the signs. Gerald Fitch did. The creek north of town was the lowest in 20 years. Roy Caldwell's well was working harder than usual, cycling longer, recovering slower. The county agricultural report noted snowpack significantly below average. Soil moisture readings were falling faster than the calendar explained. Old-timers started whispering a number. 1988. July hit like an oven door. The sky turned white and stayed there. Temperature records broke 3 times in 2 weeks. Fields that looked green in June were pale by mid-July. By August, the county stopped pretending. Crops stood brittle and defeated. Ponds showed cracked earth where water used to be. Dale Pruitt was hauling water to his cattle twice a day. His pastures, 300 acres of the best grazing land in the county, turned brown, then gray, then the color of something that had given up. Photorealistic wide aerial shot of drought-devastated farmland in Garner County. White blazing sky, no clouds. Fields that were green are now pale yellow, turning brown. Cracked dry earth visible between rows of wilting crops. Heat haze distorting the horizon. Empty, dried-out farm ponds showing cracked mud bottoms. The landscape looks exhausted, bleached, dying. No people in frame, just the enormity of the drought. Harsh overhead summer light washed out colors, oppressive heat visible in the air. Photorealistic, cinematic, environmental devastation, epic scale, 16:9 aspect ratio. He lost 3 head in 1 week. Found the first one on a Tuesday morning down in the far pasture, too weak to stand. The vet said dehydration. Dale stood over the animal and didn't speak for a long time. He sold 20 head the following week at 1/3 of their value because he couldn't keep them watered. His wife called their daughter in the city and asked if they could stay for a while, just in case. Wells failed one after another across the county, 5 in August, 3 more in September. Roy Caldwell's quit on a Tuesday morning. Roy was 52. He had drilled that well the year he turned 30. 22 years of water. Every morning, reliable as sunrise. He'd built his whole operation around it. 300 acres of feed corn. 100 head. A life measured in seasons and water, and the assumption that the ground would always give. That Tuesday, he turned on the pump the way he always did. The motor hummed. The pipe vibrated. But nothing came. He waited. Checked the connections, restarted. Waited again. Nothing. He stood in the middle of his field with the sun pressing down on him like a hand looking at cattle that were waiting at the trough. The way they waited every morning, and for the first time in his life, Roy Caldwell put his hand over his face and wept. Nobody saw it. He made sure of that. But that afternoon, driving home on County Road 7, he passed the Mercer property, and he saw the pond. Still full, still holding. 6 feet of water catching the late summer light like polished glass in the middle of a county that was turning to dust. Roy pulled over, sat in his truck, stared at the water for a very long time. Then he drove home and didn't tell anyone what he'd seen. Caleb's pond held 12 feet by mid-August. He ran gravity-fed lines to 200 acres. Livestock drank without restriction. Lower fields still produced, while everything around turned to dust. It hadn't saved everything, but it bought him what no one else had: time. 8, maybe 10 weeks of water when the county had nothing. In drought management, 10 weeks is the difference between a hard year and a ruined one. One afternoon in late August, Caleb was checking the water line when he saw a truck he didn't recognize parked on County Road 7. A family was loading the last of their belongings into the bed. Furniture, boxes, a child's bicycle strapped sideways. They were leaving. A small operation 2 miles south. Couldn't make it through the drought. Couldn't afford to stay. The land had been in their family for 2 generations, and now it was empty. The truck pulled past the Mercer property slowly. Through the back window, a small boy, maybe 6 or 7, pressed his hand against the glass and waved at Caleb. Caleb waved back. Then he turned and looked at his grandfather's pond. Still holding. Still full enough. And for the first time, what he felt wasn't pride. It was weight. The heavy, quiet kind that comes when you have what others lost. Not because you're smarter, because someone loved you enough to leave you a notebook. Roy Caldwell showed up first, 5 a.m. on a Wednesday. Caleb was already in the barn. He heard the truck before he saw it. Then the knock, not on the front door, on the barn door, like a man who didn't feel he'd earned the porch. Roy stood in the dark with his hat in his hands, eyes red, jaw tight. The kind of face a man wears when he is about to say something that costs him everything he thought he was. "My well quit," he said. "My cattle won't make it through the week. I don't have anywhere else to go." Caleb looked at him. This was the same man who had stood in the feed store and laughed when Bud called his reservoir a mess. The same man who had shaken his head at the idea of a 15-year-old playing farmer. Now he was standing in Caleb's barn at 5 in the morning asking for water. Caleb didn't make him wait. Didn't make him say more. Didn't remind him of anything. "Bring your truck at 7, he said. "I'll have a line ready." Roy stood still for a moment. Then he said quietly, "Your granddaddy would have done the same thing." Caleb nodded. "I know. That's why I'm doing it." Roy wasn't the last. Within a week, 2 more families came. Then a third. Caleb opened gravity-fed lines to 3 neighboring operations. He ran water to cattle that weren't his fields, that weren't his families that had laughed at his hole 4 months ago. His mother watched the water level drop from 12 feet to 10. Then 9, then 8. "What if it runs out?" she asked one evening, standing beside him at the pond's edge. Caleb looked at the notebook in his hand. The same notebook he had almost closed for good on that rainy night on the porch. "Grandpa designed it for 18 million gallons, he said. "We'll make it. We'll." He was right, but barely. By mid-September, the water was holding at just under 7 feet. Enough. But every day felt like borrowing from a loan that had no guarantor except the engineering of a dead man. Dale Pruitt showed up on a Thursday in September. He didn't call ahead, didn't send his son, didn't bring a neighbor for moral support. He came alone, parked his truck at the edge of the property, walked to the pond without saying a word. His pastures were dead. He'd spent 6 weeks buying water to keep what was left of his herd alive. He had sold half his cattle at prices that would have made his father sick. His wife had stopped asking how bad it was because the answer was always worse than the last time she asked. He stood at the rim of the reservoir and looked at the water. It was lower than June, but it was there, still and clean and impossibly present. A great blue heron was fishing the far shore, in water that had no business existing in a county this dry. Dale stared at the bird for a long time. He hadn't seen a heron in Garner County in almost 20 years. "How much you got left?" he asked without looking at Caleb. "Enough. I guess I was wrong about what this was." He walked back to his truck and came back with a 6-pack of water bottles. He set them on the tailgate, then stopped and looked at them. Then he looked at the 12 acres of water behind a 15-year-old boy. His face changed. Something between embarrassment and grief. Like a man bringing a cup of water to someone who owned a lake. "Habit," he muttered. Caleb almost smiled. It was the closest thing to an apology Dale Pruitt had ever given anyone. They stood in silence for a while, two people looking at water that one of them had built and the other had mocked. Then Dale said something Caleb didn't expect. "I've been doing this 40 years. My daddy did it before me. I thought I knew this land better than anyone alive." He paused. "A 15-year-old kid with a notebook just showed me I didn't know a damn thing about being ready." Caleb didn't answer. He just looked at his grandfather's pond. That fall, the county extension office held a meeting on water resilience. The room was 3 times as full as expected, standing room only. Farmers who hadn't attended a meeting in a decade showed up with notebooks of their own. Caleb sat in the back row. Same place he sat at school. Same quiet. Same dirt under his fingernails. They asked him to speak. He walked to the front and answered questions plainly. No slides, no polish, no charm. Just a boy who had built something real, explaining how he did it. Someone asked how he'd known the drought was coming. "I didn't know," he said. "I just remembered what my grandpa taught me." Someone asked if it was worth the risk. He thought about that one. The risk was not building it. Someone asked what his grandfather would think. Caleb paused longer than usual. "I think he'd say it took me long enough." The room laughed. But it was the good kind, the kind that comes from respect, not ridicule. Dale broke ground on his own reservoir the following spring. So did Roy Caldwell. Within a year, 7 operations in the county were building water storage based on principles Harlan Mercer had put in a notebook 30 years before anyone was ready to listen. The following spring, Caleb walked out to the pond at dawn the way he always did. Coffee in his hand, notebook in his jacket. The letters still in his shirt pocket, so worn now the folds had turned soft as cloth. He saw it before he reached the water. A great blue heron, standing at the far end of the pond, still as stone, watching the surface like it was reading something written underneath. Then he saw the nest. The bird had built it in the low brush at the water's edge, settled in, chosen this place to raise its young. Caleb stood very still for a long time. He remembered his grandfather's words. "When the herons leave the waters going, when they come back, you did something right." 20 years since anyone had seen a heron nest in Garner County. Caleb pulled out his phone and took one photo. Just one. No filter, no caption, no audience. Then he went home, opened the notebook to the last page, past the reservoir drawings, past the rainfall records, past the drainage maps, past the letter, and tucked the photo inside, right next to his grandfather's design. That was the only review that mattered. Caleb Mercer never set out to teach anyone anything. He was just a boy finishing what his grandfather started. But he showed an entire county that preparation is not pessimism, that listening to those who came before you is not weakness, that a notebook full of old handwriting can be worth more than 40 years of experience if the experience never learned to look ahead, and that sometimes the wisest decision in the county looks exactly like a 15-year-old kid digging himself a fishing pond. The land teaches these lessons slowly, and only to those willing to listen. His mother still works at the hospital. but only day shifts now. The farm pays for itself. Gerald Fitch still comes by on Tuesdays. He brings coffee and data. Caleb brings questions. They stand at the fence line the way Gerald once stood with Harlan, watching the water catch the light, and talking about things that take longer than one lifetime to build. Dale Pruitt's reservoir filled its first winter. He never said thank you in words, but the following Christmas, he left a package on the Mercer porch. Inside was a framed photo of the great blue heron on Caleb's pond taken from the road. On the back in Dale's handwriting it said, "You were right. Roy Caldwell's new well came in that spring, but he built a reservoir anyway." When his grandson asked why, Roy said, "Because a kid smarter than me proved that wells quit. Water you save doesn't." Caleb is 16 now. He still sits in the back row at school, still doesn't talk much, still has dirt under his fingernails. But when he walks across that land at dawn, past the reservoir, his grandfather dreamed, and he built past the heron nest at the water's edge, past the channels that carry rain exactly where a dead man's notebook said they would. He walks like someone who understands something most people spend a lifetime trying to learn. You don't have to be loud to be right. You don't have to be old to be wise. And you don't have to finish something in your own lifetime to make sure it gets finished. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is leave a notebook for someone who loves you enough to read it. If someone you loved left you a lesson that changed your life, drop a comment. Type, "I finished it," and let that be your story. Subscribe and turn on notifications. Share this with someone who needs to hear that quiet people build the things that last. Thank you for staying until the end. I will see you in the next one. This is a fictional story created for entertainment education and dramatic reflection. All names and events are imaginary, but the truth inside it is real. The land rewards those who prepare. And sometimes a 15-year-old boy with a shovel and a notebook is the only person paying attention.